1 year since Russia invaded Ukraine, there are few signs of any kind of ceasefire. In fact, all of the indications are that the fighting is about to get even worse. So how will this conflict end? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampsheir. Far from finding a road to peace, the indications are that both Ukraine and Russia are planning brand new spring offensives. Huge swathes of Ukraine have been laid to waste in the last 12 months. Russia's economy is creaking and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives. Despite that, there are few signs either side is ready to back down. So, what has to happen before everybody sits down around the negotiating table? Or will one side collapse first? To discuss this on our panel today, we have in Kyiv Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, who is a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and chair of the Committee of Ukraine's integration into the European Union. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, we have Sir Anthony Brenton. He's a former British ambassador to Russia, 2004 to 2008. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., William Harrison Courtney, senior fellow at RAND Corporation, a public policy think tank, and he is a former US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. Ivanna, let me start off with you and say, what does the end of this war in Ukraine look like to you? What do you see as being the outcome when it's all over?
Well, thank you for having me on the program. Hello. Obviously, we in Ukraine would like to have the ideal end of the war. That means having the Russian Federation being kicked out from all the territory of Ukraine. Would like to ensure that we are restoring our territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence according to our borders of 1991, as it is accepted by the whole world. And we would like to ensure that in the meantime, we would get security guarantees, for example, NATO membership, that would ensure that Russian Federation would not be able to attack again. And with regard to Russia, I think it has to be defeated. It has to be weakened to the extent that it cannot wage another attack on anybody. It has to be punished and it has to be isolated. I think that that would be a great end of this war.
So, Tony, do you think that that's a realistic expectation? Obviously, that's been the line of the West and of Ukraine's allies since this war began, that Ukraine should be returned to its 1991-1992 borders. Nonetheless, is that a realistic expectation in your opinion?
I think it's probably the outer limits of what's achievable, actually. It's interesting that the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, has expressed his doubts about the likelihood of Ukraine being able to reoccupy Crimea, for example, by force. I think it's also slightly worrying that to achieve that outcome might take a very long and brutal and bloody continuation of this conflict. It might make more sense to look for something which brings the thing to an end earlier, which undoubtedly Russia has to be seen to lose, but also minimizes the likelihood of the conflict becoming more general and even more disastrous.
William, what's your take on this, especially since, of course, you have some experience with the ends of conflicts with Russia, having been a former ambassador to Georgia?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to participate. Making predictions is quite difficult. I think it's fair to say that what we are likely to see now is Russia having an edge in mass, numbers of soldiers on the field, maybe even amount of equipment, but Ukraine will have a qualitative edge. Its soldiers are better trained and they're more willing to fight. There's more support for them in civil society in Ukraine, and they are likely to have better equipment because of Western supplies. So these factors may play a role in determining the outcome, but foreseeing the outcome is just too difficult. There could be regime change in Moscow. There are a lot of elite pressures now in Moscow. The Ukrainians could win decisively on the battlefield. There could be surprise attacks from Russia that can't be anticipated. So making predictions is just too uncertain.
Ivanna, among your colleagues, you're a member of the Ukrainian Parliament. There has to be some room for maneuver there. Is everyone sticking rigidly to the line of the 1991-1992 borders, or are people saying, well, if we can get back as much territory as possible, or if we can get back everything except Crimea, is there wriggle room as far as people are concerned in the parliament, or is it simply not tenable to take that position at the moment inside the country?
Well, first we have to understand that Ukraine is a democracy, and we are considering our position based on what our people think. And more than 85% of the Ukrainian population at this particular moment, irrespectively of what Russian actions would be further, even up to usage of the tactical nuclear weapons, are pushing for further fight for our restoring of our territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. So therefore, I think it would be suicidal for any politicians to consider something different at this particular point. And that's one thing. But we also have to understand that if, for example, we would consider leaving some parts of the Ukrainian territory with Russia after the end of this war, that would mean that actually Russia has won, because that means that borders can be changed by force, that the post-World War II geopolitical order and the international law have been failing. And that means that would be also an invitation for others to engage in other conflicts across the globe in order to change borders by force. So I think the consequences would be much, much wider than just to say what will happen with Ukraine.
William, the comment from Ivanna there that if Russia is left with any territory over and above what it had at the start of this conflict, they can make a claim to having won. Is that not really an encouragement that Vladimir Putin has already had, having seen him sneak Transnistria half away from Moldova, having seen him sneak Abkhazia away from Georgia? Is that not part of why we're in the position we're currently in, where we are right now with Ukraine?
Well, the Russians have had this revanchist instinct, if you will, to recover territories that Moscow ruled in the past. And so after the Soviet collapse, there were Russian troops in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, in Transnistria in Moldova. And then, of course, in 2008, Russia sought to seize more in Georgia. 2014, it invaded Ukraine for the first time. So what we see is a pretty determined effort by Russia to take over neighbors' territories. If, as Ivanna points out, Russia is left to control some Ukrainian territory, this really tears apart the European security order since World War II, which depended on the premise of neighbors not seizing other neighbors' territory. So I think this is one reason why, for the West, this is becoming a more existential war. It's not just existential for the Kremlin, but also for the West.
So, Tony, do you agree with that?
No, I'm afraid not. And the most recent change of borders in Europe was, of course, when NATO took Kosovo away from Serbia. So it's not only Russia who does this sort of stuff. The war in Georgia, of course, was started by the Georgians, as was firmly confirmed by a report by the EU afterwards. I agree that Russia has become very troublesome and needs to be seen to lose this war. But if we build ourselves up to demanding utter crushing defeat for Russia, then we are in exactly the same position as the triumphant Allies were in 1918 at the end of the First World War. And we could well be stirring up a lot of trouble from a very humiliated, angry, resentful, nuclear-armed Russia another 20 years down the track.
Ivanna, I see you shaking your head there.
Well, I think that we need some lessons, history lessons being taught also in this room, because Russia basically has attacked Georgia back in 1992, 1993, and that's exactly when Abkhazia and South Ossetia was taken from Georgia by the Russian Federation. So the 2008 war, that is already a consequence of the first attack of the Russian Federation, which was not reacted to by the world. And then the world did not react to 2008. The world did not react or rather reacted pitifully to Russian annexation of Crimea and parts of the eastern Ukraine back in 2014, and that's why we've been feeding the appetite of the aggressor, and that's exactly what you are suggesting right now. Just continue feeding his ambitions, his appetites, and indulge for the crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocidal crimes, and basically crime of aggression that has been carried on our territory.
So, Tony, the Russian mindset towards these things is generally a sort of spheres of influence one. This could be viewed, to sort of extrapolate it out to the limits, almost as a colonial war. The Russians attempting to assert authority over what in their own minds they regard as a renegade province. How do you view that?
Well, what they have done is entirely illegal and indefensible. And as I've said, they need to be seen to lose the war. But you need to think beyond the end of the war to what we leave ourselves with. And as I've said, if we leave ourselves with a sort of Weimar Russia, then we're storing up trouble for us further down the line. We need to win the war. Russia needs to be put in a position where they cannot do it again. So I agree entirely with Ivanna that Ukraine needs adequate security guarantees when the war ends. But I also think that we need to find ways of re-engaging with Russia when the war is over and to try and attract them back into a better relationship with Europe. And sorry, I'm going to add one other point. A lot of the background to this is, of course, that the big rising confrontation in the world isn't this war in Europe. It's between China and the United States. And it's quite important which side of that conflict Russia falls on. At the moment, our actions, particularly the outcomes that people are thinking about for this war, are guaranteed to push Russia into China's arms.
William, what's your take on that?
Well, I think the question of Russia after the war is over, certainly Russia should be departing all of Ukraine, including Crimea and the part of eastern Donbass that it took in 2014. There should be no Russian troops left in Ukraine. But the question of what Russia will do after that really depends on the Russian people. Right now, Russia has a revanchist regime. It has never been, in its 30 years of independence, it has never been more repressive internally than it is now, and it's never been more aggressive externally than it is now, as we see in Ukraine. So for Russia to change, the Russians themselves have to do that. They have to find a way, and they have in the past. Sometimes when they've overreached, they have ended up changing in a way in which allows them to accommodate themselves with the West. For example, when Stalin died, political prisoners were released. At the end of the Brezhnev era, the Russians, the Soviets, brought forth a liberal leader in Gorbachev. So we can't rule out the idea that Russia will self-correct. We cannot automatically assume that there could be a Weimar Germany in Russia afterwards.
Okay, if I take some comments that came out from General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US military's Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he was asked this question, he said, and I quote, "For this year, it would be very, very difficult to militarily eject the Russian forces from every inch of Ukraine or Russian-occupied Ukraine. That doesn't mean it can't happen, doesn't mean it won't happen, but it would be very, very difficult." Now, if I tack on to the back of that quote, William, that Vladimir Putin has claimed to have fully integrated Crimea and a couple of other aspects of Ukraine, but mostly Crimea, into the Russian Federation, and then said he will protect the land that he regards as the sovereign territory of Russia with nuclear weapons. Suddenly the ante's getting upped and upped and upped and upped to the point where perhaps Ukraine can get back everything that is part of the contiguous landmass, but not Crimea. Is that not an acceptable outcome then?
It's certainly a possible outcome. Militarily seizing Crimea would be more difficult than the rest of Ukraine because it would require amphibious combat forces of a kind which Ukraine doesn't really have. And there's a narrow isthmus that Russia could block, a land isthmus between the rest of Ukraine and Crimea. So militarily it would be more challenging. But nonetheless, the Russians have made a lot of mistakes thus far, and it is possible that they could make more. You'll recall at the beginning of the war, there were predictions by some people that Russians would be around Kiev within 72 hours. Those turned out to be false. So looking back over the last year, almost all the developments that have occurred have involved some element of surprise. Most recently, the seizure of the large part of the vital Kharkiv region of Ukraine. So it's just difficult to predict what will happen. But Ukraine is well motivated. They are well armed now, and they may surprise us.
So, Tony, Ukraine is well motivated. Ukraine's armed forces have been extremely well trained. However, there are analysts out there who say this war cannot go on much longer than, say, 18 months from now. Ukraine will run out of people. Russia will run out of kit and money.
Yeah, I mean, William is entirely right that Ukraine could win on the battlefield, and our debating where we want to go here becomes completely beside the point. But for the moment, it looks as if Russia is completely stuck. They're bogged down. They're fighting for Bakhmut, a town of which no one had ever previously heard, and it looks as if they're now saying it's going to take them until April to get it. If it turns out that Ukraine is bogged down in the same way, now that's not guaranteed. As you say, the Ukrainian forces have lots of virtues which the Russian forces don't. But if it turns out that they are similarly bogged down when they resume their offensives in the spring, then we could be in for a very long, bloody, slogging match between the two, where the odds, well, first of all, where the destruction is terrible, and secondly, where the odds on some sort of accident or deliberate malfeasance raises the probability of direct war between NATO, between my country, the UK, and Russia. No one wants to see that. So if the thing does bog down, at that point, pressure for talks will rise. And I think those talks in those circumstances could be useful.
Is there any way, Sir Tony, to allow Russia a face-saving exit here? I mean, they kind of backed themselves fully into a corner, haven't they? Don't they have to be beaten in order to mark it out as a win for the West? The US has also backed itself into a corner here.
Yes, they have to be beaten, as I've already said.
Yeah.
And a defeat for them would be to go back to the lines before the war actually started, which would leave Crimea with them. I have to say I'm genuinely bothered about Crimea. I mean, I don't believe in people taking territory by force, but there's lots of evidence that the population of Crimea actually would prefer to be Russian than to be Ukrainian. And there's very clear evidence that Russia, if they're going to fight brutally and if necessarily with nuclear weapons for anything, it will be Crimea. So as I say, you know, I hope that we will get to the stage of talks before we get to that sort of very dangerous confrontation indeed.
Ivanna, the longer this war goes on, the more difficult things become for Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been supplied with an enormous amount of military assistance from outside, but a lot of what is being supplied as aid is in fact being supplied in the form of loans. Is Ukraine not going to find itself in a very difficult position that it just simply becomes too thoroughly indebted and even a win is a loss then for them?
This war for us is about survival of the nation and survival of the state. And if we consider the possibility that Ukraine is losing this war, that means that none of us is alive. And that's, I think, you would have to understand that. Neither myself, nor my family, nor my loved ones, my friends, whoever, and all of our people who are Ukrainian, they would not have the chance to survive in that no man's land, which could be occupied by the Russian Federation, for example. So therefore, for us, it's important to ensure that our courage and our spirit and our resolve is high. And that is what is happening at this point. But we need instruments. We need instruments as much as possible. And the urgency of the delivery of those instruments is something that matters. That means the equipment, the quality and quantity of those weapons that have been promised to Ukraine. With regard to our indebtedness, well, definitely it's going to be a harsh time after the end of the war. But that's, again, if we have the future ray of light by transforming the country and then joining also the EU and, kind of releasing our creative spirits that hopefully will still remain. That means that we will manage to deal with those problems as well.
William, within the last 2 weeks, the British Ministry of Defence has released a report in which it says that 97% of Russian forces are now committed in Ukraine. Now, if we can take those numbers as being accurate numbers, is now not the time for the West to try and find some additional way of stressing Russia by opening up, if not quite a second front, then an additional stress point, either getting Moldova to go into Transnistria or getting Georgia to try and take back Abkhazia, or looking at getting the Syrian rebels in Syria to go after the Russian port city of Tartus, or one of various other different stressor points that could be applied?
Well, that's an interesting concept that in the past, great power strategists would have thought about that. But today, in our democratic world, the support in the West is for the West to help Ukraine defeat Russia. So, for example, recently now the United States has started giving Ukraine something called a ground-launched small diameter bomb. That has, it's a rocket-based artillery that has about twice the range of the HIMARS that Ukraine has been using so effectively thus far. So Ukraine is getting more capable weapons. It's quite possible they will get Western combat aircraft soon, and perhaps some other systems, certainly tanks. But thus far, Ukraine has done quite well. It's used the weapons that the West has provided very effectively. And so people in the West are pretty optimistic that Ukraine will fight effectively going forward.
William, thank you for that. Ivanna, this is the point, I'm afraid, where we have to say goodbye to you, because I understand you have a very important debate to go and vote in. Thank you very much for joining us today. So, Tony, if I can move on to you. In your opinion, do you have any indications for how much more appetite there is in the West to keep supplying arms and assistance to Ukraine? I understand that right now everybody is saying that, yes, the West will keep supporting Ukraine. But of course, when the West initially started sending armaments to Ukraine, they were sending old stockpiles of weaponry. Now they're beginning to dig into newer stockpiles of weaponry. At some point, supplying additional materiel to Ukraine becomes difficult for countries that are doing it.
I think it depends which part of the West you're talking about. There's certainly a very firm appetite here in the UK to continue supplying Ukraine in effect with whatever it needs. Well, I think we're pretty close to the limit as we think about fighter aircraft, for example. You're thinking about a piece of kit where training someone up to fly it and extending runways to fly it off is going to take months, and therefore is unlikely to have any very direct effect on the outcome of the war. But it feels in the UK, and indeed in the Baltic states and in Poland, that commitment to giving Ukraine as much as we can remains strong. That is less true in places like Germany and France, who are more concerned about the continuing destruction of the war, about the economic damage it is doing to Europe, all of that, and are therefore keener than we are, actually, to bring the war to a negotiated solution. Now, what we absolutely don't want to see is a major split in the West, which means that we do need to strike a balance between those two approaches to how we bring the war to a conclusion.
William, in your opinion, does the West's supplying of aid and supplying of materiel to Ukraine, does it have a limit? Are we reaching that point yet, or can you see that limit being reached at some stage?
Certainly, the United States has strong bipartisan support for continuing to support Ukraine's military. That was evidenced most recently, of course, by President Biden's somewhat risky trip to Kiev, but also recently the visit of the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, and the leader of the Republicans, Mitch McConnell, in the Senate. So while we have a few people on the right, a few people on the left who are not so eager to provide so much more, generally there's pretty strong support. And when we look back in our history, there have been a number of times when there have been controversies. For example, in the Point Forward program after the war to support Turkey and Greece fighting communist guerrillas, to support South Korea when the North Koreans invaded. And even in the 1970s, there were pressures in the Congress to bring U.S. troops out of Europe. But in all those cases, the U.S. persisted. There was strong support, and I think that will be the case this time. Our defense industry is ramping up production of various items, and I think we're seeing that in Europe as well. So I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be taking too much kit from the West.
William, Courtney, Sir Anthony, Brenton, thank you very much, both of you, for joining me. We were also joined, of course, by Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for on today's debate. But remember, you can see more of our discussions and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.